In this lecture, we are going to take a look at religion in ancient Rome. Religion was a very big deal in ancient Rome. The Romans took religion very, very seriously. In fact, the Romans attributed a lot of their success to their strict adherence to religious practice and customs. They believed firmly that their success was due to the fact that they were the most religious city-state of all. It was the Greeks and Etruscans who had an enormous impact on the development of religion in Rome. Early on, it would have been the Etruscans, and later on, it was the Greeks. Now, like many ancient civilizations, the Romans based much of their beginnings on a foundation myth. The Romans loved everything Greek, so they tried to tie much of the foundation of Rome to ancient Greek mythology. The specific character that emerges is Aeneas. Aeneas is said to have fled Troy after it was sacked. It was his descendants, Romulus and Remus, that were involved with the foundation of the city itself. And of course, as the story goes, Romulus murdered his brother Remus and then founded the city of Rome. One thing you will notice is this theme of violence with the foundation of Rome. But it was a violent period, and Rome needed to resort to war many times to expand this increasingly successful republic. So Romulus becomes the first king of Rome. After Romulus comes Numa, who became the second king of Rome. Numa is the most significant person in the development of the ancient Roman religion. Many of the offices and structure of the religion are attributed to Numa. After Numa died, it is generally believed that the religion of Rome was all set. It was well established. One of the most famous structures that Numa built was the Temple of Janus. During times of peace, the doors were shut to the temple. During times of war, the doors of the temple would remain open. So you can imagine how long those doors remained open during the Punic Wars. Now, according to Livy, there were 12 great gods. Those are the gods that he identifies. They were Jupiter and Juno, Neptune and Minerva, Mars and Venus, Apollo and Diana, Vulcan and Vesta, and Mercury and Ceres. Now, the Greeks took much of the Greek religion and incorporated it into their own. So many of the Greek gods were equated with ancient Roman gods. So, for instance, Zeus is equated with Jupiter, and Poseidon with Neptune, and so on and so on. Now, one thing the Romans did was they organized their gods into triads. Those were actually very, very important. The most important triad was the archaic triad, and these were the first 3 gods worshipped in Rome, and you can see that list right here. Now, later on, the triad was updated to include Juno and Minerva, and so the archaic triad was renamed to the Capitoline triad, and that became the standard triad going forward. Now, the public priesthoods in ancient Rome consisted of 4 major colleges, and of those 4, the 2 most important are the College of Pontiffs and the College of Augurs, and between those 2, the College of Pontiffs was considered to be the most illustrious. So we will first discuss the College of Pontiffs. A priest that was a member of this college was referred to as a pontiff. It was the pontiffs who controlled all aspects of the state religion, whether public or private. They also provided guidance and information to anyone who needed assistance on matters relating to religion. In addition, the pontiffs decided any cases related to religious law. They also made sure that rituals and sacrifices were conducted according to custom and tradition. Violation of a custom or law was always handled by the pontiffs. Usually this meant a fine, but in severe cases it could result in death. The pontiffs themselves were not subject to any outside court or punishment. Interfering with a pontiff was considered a high crime in Rome and could result in death. Pontiffs were allowed to hold other military, civil, and even other priestly offices. However, it was not allowed if there was a conflict of interest between the various offices the individual held. It's important to note that pontiffs were generally not associated with any specific deity. They administered the state religion from an overall perspective. 2 notable exceptions to this rule were the Flamins and the vestals. They were actually associated with a specific deity, and we will get to them in a minute. Now, the overall person in charge of the pontiffs would have been the pontifex maximus. That was the most significant religious position in ancient Rome, the most esteemed, the most sought after. Julius Caesar himself ran for this office before he became a consul, and actually staked his entire political career on winning election to this office. And he did in fact win, but that was just how important this office was. It was reserved usually only for the most important members in ancient Roman society. That meant it was only open to patricians, at least early on. But finally, in 254 BC, a plebeian was finally assigned to the post. Later on, during imperial times, the emperor assumed the title of Pontifex Maximus for himself. In 381, the Roman emperor finally decided to discontinue the title of Pontifex Maximus. It was then taken by the Pope. Another important member of the College of Pontiffs was the Rex Sacrorum. In theory, the Rex Sacrorum was held in even higher esteem than the Pontifex Maximus. But this was in theory only, as it was the Pontifex Maximus who selected the Rex Sacrorum. Also, the Rex Sacrorum was barred for life from pursuing any career in politics or the military. The Pontifex Maximus, on the other hand, faced no such restrictions. Now let's talk about the Flamins. The Flamins were members of the College of Pontiffs. They were actually devoted to the service of a specific god. The number of Flamins was gradually increased to 15, so 15 priests assigned to a different deity. The Flamin's inauguration was handled by the Pontifex Maximus. The appointment was for life, though a Flamin could be replaced, especially if they botched a sacrifice. One of the most important Flamins of all was the Flamin of Jupiter. He enjoyed many benefits. First, he had the right to a lictor. A lictor, among other things, was in charge of security for the individual he was protecting. The Flamin also was granted a seat in the Senate, and he also had the right to wear a toga. These benefits were counterbalanced by some restrictions, and this is something you'll see constantly in some of these offices. There were enormous benefits, but there were also some restrictions. So the Flamin of Jupiter was not allowed to be out of the city for even a single night. Most peculiar of all, he was not allowed to touch a horse. There were also many other restrictions. These were done so that the Flamin paid constant attention to his duties in the service of Jupiter. One of the most sacred structures in ancient Rome was the Temple of Vesta. The temple was maintained by the virgin priestesses of Vesta. The Vestals were the only female members of the College of Pontiffs. Altogether, there were 6 priestesses that were responsible for the temple. The tradition of the Vestas was one of Rome's oldest, dating all the way back to Alba Longa. There were strict requirements in order to qualify. A candidate was not allowed to be younger than 6 years old, but could not be older than 10. All of the candidates were selected by the Pontifex Maximus, after which one was chosen by lot for the vacancy. After the candidate was chosen, the father was expected to relinquish all control over his daughter. In effect, the new recruit became the property of the god Vesta. Once the candidate was selected, the Pontifex Maximus would lead the new recruit into the precincts of the sacred college. A Vestal was expected to serve a term of 30 years. The Vestal spent her first 10 years in training, the next 10 years she performed her assigned duties, and in the final 10 years the Vestal provided instruction to new recruits. The senior priestess was entitled Vestalis Maxima. The purity of the Vestals was all important, and so they were bound to a solemn vow of chastity. Violation of this vow was dealt with very severely, and punishment could involve being buried alive. The most important duty of the Vestals was to maintain the everlasting fire which burned upon the altar of Vesta. As long as that flame burned, ancient Rome would enjoy prosperity and security. So it was up to the Vestals to monitor that flame. Therefore, each Vestal was assigned a watch over the flame. If for any reason the fire burned out, the Vestal on watch was held accountable. The Vestal could be whipped for failing in her duty, and even stripped of her position by the Pontifex Maximus. While the Vestal's life might have been seen as harsh, they did in fact enjoy enormous benefits. The Vestals were maintained by public funds provided by the Roman government. They were even allowed to own property. Vestals were considered to be the most important women in ancient Rome, and enjoyed enormous power. When Sulla became master of all Rome, he began to purge his opponents. Sulla even wanted to eliminate Caesar as he greatly feared the young man's growing ambitions. It was the Vestals who came to Caesar's rescue and blocked Sulla. The Vestals had many other duties, including administering marriage ceremonies and wills. In fact, it was the Vestals who released the will of Julius Caesar after his death. Now, just to give you an idea how important the Romans considered the Vestals, after the empire had converted to Christianity, many of the pagan rituals were abolished, including the Vestal Virgins. In 394, Emperor Theodosius shut down the Vestal College, and the temple's eternal flame burned out. Just 80 years later, the empire collapsed. Many Roman citizens attributed the fall of Rome to the fact that the fire had been extinguished. Now let's take a look at augurs. Augurs were the priests that were members of the College of Augurs. It was their job to interpret the will of the gods in future events. These were revealed to the augurs in the form of signs that were sent by the gods. The primary god sending the messages was Jupiter. The augurs were similar in every sense to the Oracle of Delphi, in that they interpreted and read signs sent by the gods. The main difference was that the Greeks did not receive messages from Zeus. Instead, the messages were sent by Apollo. So that's the key difference there. It is important to note that augurs did not provide any detail regarding future events. They simply told a person what they should or should not do. So let's say you wanted to build a house. You would almost certainly visit an augur who would look for a sign from the gods. After the sign had been interpreted, the augur would give you a simple yes or no. Nothing more than that. No explanation was needed, just a simple yes or no. So it was expected that all matters relating to war, commerce, and religion, whether private or public, needed the auspices read and interpreted by the augurs. Augurs almost always accompanied a Roman general on a military campaign. They would have been required to read many of the signs during the expedition. Ancient armies were often spooked by strange events, so it was important to have an augur on hand that could calm the nerves of the rank and file. An augur usually made his observations with a crooked wand. The wand would mark out a ritual space in the sky, which was called a templum. The passage of birds through the templum indicated divine favor or disfavor for a given undertaking. The augur would often wait in silence until a favorable sign appeared. During this time, it was not permitted to interrupt the augur. If there was an interruption, the reading was considered invalid. The augurs also would consecrate the ground on which a temple was built. If it was not consecrated by an augur, the structure usually could not be deemed a temple. The signs the augurs were looking for were often called the auspices. In fact, the entire observation itself by the augur was considered an auspice. Auspices were divided into two main categories: auspices that were requested by people and those offered spontaneously by the gods. In addition, there were 5 main types of auspices that could be observed. The first and most important involved birds. From the earliest of times, many ancient cultures believed birds were used to transport messages of the gods. Specifically, the flight pattern of birds could be examined, especially the flight of ravens, vultures, and crows. Eagles were given a preeminent status as it was considered to be the bird of Jupiter. Birds could be examined by what noises they made in flight, whether they were in a group or alone, the direction of the flight, and of course the type of bird. The process of examination was known as the taking of the auspices. A second type of auspice involved examining the feeding patterns of chickens. A third type involved the sky, mainly thunder and lightning. Livy often refers to lightning events, and it was important to read the sign, especially if lightning struck an important statue or temple. Auspices could also be taken from animals that walked on 4 feet. These were usually taken from foxes, wolves, horses, and even dogs. This type of auspice was taken if an animal crossed a person's path or was found in some unusual location. A final type of augury was more of a generic one that could provide for any event or occurrence that did not fall into the first 4 types. Augurs were elected to the college for life. A newly elected recruit was given an elaborate banquet. Altogether, there were 15 augurs. Livy writes that, quote, "The college of augurs were held in such honor that nothing was undertaken in peace or war without their sanction," end quote. Another type of college in ancient Rome were the quindecimviri. The quindecimviri were responsible for the protection of the Sibylline books. The Sibylline books were a collection of prophecies written in Greek. According to tradition, the books were purchased by the last king of Rome. According to the story, the seller originally offered the king 9 books of these prophecies, but the king refused to pay the requested price. The seller then proceeded to burn 3 of these books. Still, the king refused, and once again, 3 more books were burned. Finally, the king relented and purchased the last 3 books. To add insult to injury, the king was still forced to pay the original price. Okay, so again, it was the responsibility of the quindecimviri to keep the books safe. Members of this college were usually ex-consuls or government officials who previously held high positions. They kept the position for life and were exempt from all other public duties. In times of a crisis, the Senate commanded the quindecimviri to consult the Sibylline books. For instance, after Rome's devastating disaster at the Battle of Cannae, the books were consulted. On the book's recommendation, 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks were buried alive. The 4th major college was the epulones. Their main responsibility was to administer feasts and public banquets at festivals and games. It is important to note that originally this duty belonged to the College of Pontiffs, but over time a separate college was created to handle this task. Of course, we know the Romans loved to throw massive banquets and festivals, so why not have a separate college to manage this? Now let's take a look at Roman festivals. In Latin, festivals were called feriae. Most Roman festivals involved the worship of a particular god or gods, so they were an important part of Roman religious life. Many times priests from the various colleges performed the sacrifices and religious rites that were required during the festival. Festivals could be held in private or public depending on the occasion. A festival held in private was usually held by a single family or individual. A public festival often became a holiday and would be celebrated with elaborate games, feasts, and sacrifices. Many times, public festivals were observed by the entire republic or empire. Roman festivals and games usually had a fixed place on the calendar, similar to modern holidays. So let's take a look at a couple of the most important Roman festivals. The festival Saturnalia was held in late December. The festival honored Saturn, who was the god of agriculture. The holiday was celebrated with a sacrifice at the temple of Saturn, which was then followed by private gift-giving, which was in turn followed by a massive feast and party. Many of this festival's customs influenced later holidays such as Christmas and the New Year. Another important festival was the Lupercalia. A male goat and a dog were sacrificed under the supervision of the Flamin of Jupiter. These rites were performed in the cave where the Romans believed a female wolf cared for Romulus and Remus. After the sacrifice, two Luperci, as they were called, approached the altar. Their foreheads were anointed with sacrificial blood. Next, an elaborate feast was held, after which the Luperci cut skins from the sacrificed goats. The Luperci would then wear these goatskins. After that, they would complete a circuit around Palatine Hill back to the cave where the sacrifice had been performed. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar used this festival as a means to determine if Roman citizens would support him as king. It just so happened that his most trusted deputy, Mark Antony, was participating in the festival as one of the Luperci. Caesar devised a scheme to have Mark Antony offer him a wreath of laurel. But when the wreath was offered, only a few Roman citizens applauded, so Caesar rejected the offer. Once again, Antony offered the wreath, and again only a few people cheered. Caesar had his answer. Just 1 month later, he was assassinated. Now let's talk about temples. Most Roman cities and towns contained at least one temple. These housed the cult image of the deity to whom the temple was dedicated. There was usually an altar for libations or sacrifices. And once again, temples often took the name of the god to whom the structure was dedicated. The location of a temple was determined by an augur who would take the auspices in order to ensure the temple was sanctioned by the gods. If the temple was not consecrated by an augur, it could not be used as a temple, so the structure might end up as a shrine or something like that. Early on, temples were constructed in the Etruscan style. Later Roman temples were constructed in the Greek style. The inner space of the temple contained a statue of the god in question, and often there was an altar where sacrifices could be performed. Temples in Rome might be adorned with the spoils of war taken from other cities, spoils such as statues or other treasures that had been seized. Temples were maintained at the expense of the Roman treasury. Priests oversaw the day-to-day operations of the temple. Many of the menial tasks were assigned to slaves. Now, one of the most important temples in Rome was the Temple of Jupiter, which was actually referred to as the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus. It was not only the oldest temple in Rome, but it was one of the largest. Originally, the temple was constructed by Etruscan architects, but in the late Republic, it burned down, and so it was rebuilt in the Greek style. Now let's take a look at religious practices in ancient Rome. And specifically, we are going to take a look at sacrifices. Sacrificial offerings constituted the main type of worship for the Romans. They were believed to be pleasing to the gods. They were also meant to gain the favor of a god or regain the favor of a god, especially if an augur received an unfavorable omen. Sacrifices were often performed at an altar that was either inside a temple or on the outside, perhaps at a festival. Priests often performed the sacrifice to ensure that it was legitimate. There were two main types of sacrifices, bloodless and blood sacrifices. Let's take a look at bloodless sacrifices and start with libations. Libations involved pouring a liquid, usually into a sacred bowl. The type of liquid usually involved wine, but it could also include milk or honey. Sometimes the libation was diluted with water. Incense was another type of offering that was made to the gods. These often had a fragrant smell. Cedar, fig, vine, and different types of wood were burned upon the altar of the god to which it was being offered. Offerings of fruit could also be made to the gods. This was usually done to protect the harvest. Most often fruit was offered as is, without altering it in any way. The second main type of sacrifice were blood sacrifices. Human sacrifices were generally not performed in ancient Rome. There were some documented human sacrifices, but in general these were uncommon events in Rome. A second type of blood sacrifice involved animals. Many times only part of the animal were offered up. The other part was then consumed at a festival or banquet. The animals usually sacrificed were either bulls, cows, sheep, rams, lambs, goats, pigs, dogs, and horses. Part or all of the animal might be burned upon an altar before the gods. If a particular animal was favored by a god, then that animal was spared. The most common type of animal sacrifice was called the suave tarilia. This consisted of a pig, a sheep, and an ox. These were dedications to the god Mars, who was not only the god of war, but also agriculture. Before the sacrifice was performed, the 3 animals were led around the boundaries of the land, which was to be blessed and purified. Funerals were also very important during ancient Roman times. After an individual passed away, a coin was placed on the body. This was done to pay the ferryman in Hades. Early on, the deceased would have been buried. Later in the Republic, the Romans began to burn their dead. The body was laid out on a pile of wood and then burned. Cups of oil, food, and other things which were favored by the deceased were also thrown upon the flames. If the recently deceased was a person of some importance, the funeral procession was allowed to move through the forum. If the funeral was for an emperor or a major general, the soldiers marched 3 times around the fire. Okay, that's going to do it for religion in ancient Rome.